just war theory is a good thing. Christian morality is a bad thing. Unfortunately, the specific type of just war theory that we have is very much informed by Christian morality, and Israel, the Jewish state, is fighting in a more Christian way than any Christian country ever has, or any Western country ever has, and the results are unfortunately what one would expect. It is great if you have a theory, like you should for everything, on whether or not it is just or not. A war is not always the right thing to do. It is basically it should absolutely be the last resort. That's a good part of such a theory. But the idea that you should aid and abet your enemy in a time of war is unfortunately a type of turning the other cheek that is basically asking to be slapped. Morgan, your initial thoughts on just war theory and in theory and in practice.
I don't know if turn the other cheek is referring to arse cheeks. I think it's referring to facial cheeks, but never mind.
That's what I meant, but I don't
uh,
know how you. Yeah, people
oh,
slap
right, okay.
faces, you know.
Gotcha. Um, so just war theory, yeah. So in terms of its importance, if people are looking at wars in recent contexts, I know they've noticed that this isn't how wars have always been fought, and what's the thing that's changed, which is causing military leaders, leaders of countries to act in this very different, very altruistic way. Just war theory is at the root of it. And so that's why it's important to just have a bit of focus and understanding on it. Now, as you say, it's a bit of a mixed bag. I think overall it's quite a corrupt bag. And as you say, that's because it's coming from a Christian root. So the person who actually coins the term is St. Augustine, although he doesn't develop the principles very much. And that's coming about in a context where Christianity had originally been pacifistic, as you say, turn the other cheek, facial cheek. And the Roman Empire had become Christian. And so Christian thinkers now had to really pay some attention to thinking about how are we going to go to war? Because our moral code is clearly conflicting with that, and we regard war as an inherent sin. But we need to kind of compromise on that. And if you look at some of Augustine's statements or even Aquinas, although Aquinas is a bit better, they've clearly got a kind of compromise in mind, but they know they need to go and do it and how they're going to go about it. So that's the kind of background that the theory is emerging from. And broadly, just war theory is sometimes it's used to refer to kind of any theory of a just war throughout human history from many cultures. But when just war theory is used a bit more narrowly, it's referring to this kind of Christian tradition of thought, even into secular thinkers today, which are coming from that background.
Marco.
Yeah, as Razi said, just war theory sounds very good because everybody's like justice. However, if justice is coming from Christian morality, all it means that you're perpetrating an injustice, really. It's not just Israel who's using this stupid morality, but it's the whole of the Western world. The whole of the Western world has learned how not to win a war ever by applying this ancient theory, which effectively comes, as Morgan just explained, comes from the basis of Christian morality. Augustine, the altruism, the self-sacrifice, self-annihilation, that's ultimately what that morality brings you to. Morality or religion is always a morality for death, not for life. So if you start from this premise, you're guaranteed you're going to end up in a bad way.
I think just war theory has moved from academia and theologians onto as ingrained in how every nation, every Western nation certainly deals with war, and the problem there is the theory practice. It's not that there's a theory practice dichotomy; it's that the theory itself is flawed. And therefore, when it's practiced, it leads to lots of unintended consequences. It leads to wars that last longer than they should because people are pussyfooting around during them, worrying too much about the enemy's side all the time. It leads to the repetition of wars, the cycle of never-ending war that we're into because nothing is ever decisive, it's never finished, and is therefore flares up again in no time at all. And of course, it leads to more death. more death of your own side. And that own side, in most cases, in a just war, what we would consider a just war, is the death of the defending nation itself. And of course, ever since, like Vietnam War, for example, which obviously America came out of with its tail between its legs, it's meant that in future wars, people have been unwilling to define what the goals of victory are in the war, lest they be held to them when they don't achieve them. And that in itself leads to an implementation of just war, which with all these consequences I just mentioned.
Yeah, and as you say, it moved from the theologians and academics to basically becoming policy, which is the way ideas work. Ideas start from those who come up with them and explain them, and then kind of filters down into the culture and ultimately into politics. And we see this in the you mentioned Vietnam. I think it probably started before that, maybe in Korea, maybe even in right after World War II, when some people suggested that Russia, Soviet Russia, might not be a friend, and maybe it was right to fight alongside them against the Nazis. That's a whole different question. But certainly, once the war is over, they are not our friend. And maybe also now that we have this great advantage of the nuclear bomb, maybe we should, even with just the advantage of a nuclear bomb is the threat of using it. It's not necessarily that you have to use it, and maybe we can do something about that. Of course, understandably, nobody had the appetite for war. But if you look since then, how these ideas have kind of made their way into policy, I think World War II being the endpoint of fighting wars with the intention of winning, to this current war of Israel attempting to defend itself against savages, the likes of which the world had not seen in the previous century, at least not in armed conflict, and the world united, the civilized world united behind the savages, and Israel itself, thinking that the right thing to do is to help the savages. I think this is kind of the, chickens coming home to roost, in a sense. Morgan.
Well, I have some things to say on that, but we have just a clip of Obama's Nobel Prize speech, which maybe we should play because that shows its influence from thinkers down to politicians. So maybe we could just play that if we have that prepared.
And over time, as codes of law sought to control violence within groups, so did philosophers and clerics and statesmen seek to regulate the destructive power of war. The concept of a just war emerged, suggesting that war is justified only when certain conditions were met. If it is waged as a last resort or in self-defense, if the force used is proportional, and if, whenever possible, civilians are spared from violence. Of course, we know that for most of history, this concept of just war was rarely observed. The capacity of human beings to think up new ways to kill one another proved inexhaustible, as did our capacity to exempt from mercy those who look different or pray to a different God. And yet,
so I think that clip is a fairly good example. And Obama, he's receiving a peace prize, and I think is basically put on the back foot because he's just sent 10,000 more American soldiers into Afghanistan, if I'm getting the context right. And so I think feels the need to justify himself. And
just for context, this was this early 2009 when because he received the peace prize. Basically, from what I remember, this was not officially how it was announced, but basically for being not George W. Bush. That was kind of the reason for it, right? Do you remember the exact timing of this?
That would be the 9 October 89. 2009.
Oh, all right. So he had been president for a little bit. All right.
Okay, I thought it was 2008, but I might be wrong. So, I mean, even in the way he's speaking there, he's talking about it coming from the philosophers and the theologians, and now it's coming down into practice. The first time just war theory is really getting a foothold in a major way on politics is at the very, very end of the 19th century in the last kind of 2 years, and then is very influential on the founding of the League of Nations in 1920. And then, as you say, after the Second World War, Geneva Convention, all this kind of stuff, it's well kind of taken root. And that's why America's conduct in the Second World War is much closer to what I think we would say is an example of what we would consider a just war in the way they waged it and the reasons for which they entered into it. And then we see a decline in the way that wars are waged ever since then, culminating in the Iraq and Afghanistan war, if you want to say, but even in Israel today. So that's just some of that.
Marco.
Yeah, Obama got the Nobel Prize just over 8 months after he became president. And, you can't make a baby in 8 months, but you can win a Nobel Prize for peace by increasing, as Moga said, your presence in Afghanistan. But that's fine. What is war? War is effectively the initiation or use of physical force, which is necessitated by the fact that reason is no longer applicable because the other side is so gone beyond that you cannot reach an agreement. And we know that the use of physical force effectively invalidates reason at all, because if you got a gun pointed at your head, morality goes out of the window. All you have to do, you have to survive and trying to remove the threat. And that's what seems to be missing from the morality of the people that keeps pushing the theory. And the theory has got four main points, which is the wars of last resort, wars of self-defense, the good intention during the war, and the proportionality principle, which we can all talk about these things later on, but they all contribute to modern wars to last much longer. Just look what's happening now in Israel. All these calls for ceasefire, proportionality, all they're doing, they're extending the length of the war. They are causing logistical problem. They are causing Israel to push its resources to a breaking point. And then you see also the mistakes that might happen, like has happened in the last few days. All the stuff contributes to war, effectively. All pushing these theories, pushing the prevalent ideas in the West, is just contributing to more violence and more death. To the point that makes you wonder how many people do actually want to use the theory again to keep these conflicts going on forever.
One of the other mistaken definitions of war is that it's the absence of peace. And that in itself is a problem, because then you're developing a just peace theory. And all that means is always giving in to the aggressor, even if it means you're enslaved, just to have peace now. And just to avoid war. Well, that is only going to encourage more aggressors. So there is certainly a moral case for war when it comes to self-defense. And that's something that the pacifists obviously don't get right, and neither do the realists on the other side, those that dispense with morality altogether, and assume that you can just engage war wherever you feel like it, and that's not the answer either. Now, I think just going back to what I mentioned earlier about Vietnam, I think one of the legacies of Vietnam was the fact that because it took so long and there was the body count rising for US soldiers, is that ever since then, war has been on a ticking clock in terms of the sands of support from the US and from the Western countries already trickling down from the very second a war begins, lest it imitate the Vietnam War in any way. And therefore, unless it's ended soon, rather than victory is ensured, and that's how it's spoken about. It's spoken about war being ended rather than victory being achieved. And all of that, as I said before, just leads to a repetition of war down the line before long, because there's no decisive victory.
Yeah, and that's the irony of it. I mean, wanting to end a war quickly, of course, is the right thing because you don't want war to happen. But the way the way just war theory is applied, you ensure perpetual war because you embolden the people who want war, who thrive on war, whose whole existence is for war. I mean, you mentioned that you said some sentence that had the words peace now in it, and I was thinking about this organization, a big left-wing organization in Israel called Peace Now. And of course, its entire demand is not to achieve peace through a decisive defeat of the side that doesn't want peace, but it is a demand of Israel to give in to whatever demands are made. It reminds me, I know you guys don't watch Seinfeld, but I'm assuming many in the audience have watched it. There's this episode, I think it's titled Serenity Now, but it's basically there's this whole how do you self-help or something mechanism where to calm yourself when something bad happens, you just go serenity now, serenity now. You repeat it as a mantra, and of course, sorry for the spoiler, but it doesn't work. Neither does this pretense that if you say that you want peace, yeah, it does take two, and if the other side wants war, there will be war, and we that is why we see that happening in Israel and elsewhere. Morgan.
Just to say that, so just war theory there is some kind of meaningful thought about war in there. So it's not just entirely frivolous, but and one of the major developers of it in the Renaissance is Hugo Grotius, who I think is an impressive guy in many ways. But Rand makes a point that altruism is never really put over on people by rational means. It's appealed to by their emotions. And so what you'll see is that many people will adopt the precepts of just war theory, even if they don't really know about it. And you'll see it entering the public discourse, like the idea of proportionality. And it very much appeals to them, but it appeals to them for premises they've already accepted, basically through emotional means. And I think there's a meaningful way which at a deep level you can understand just war theory as being a kind of intellectual artifice, which is justifying that, or which is springing out from that emotional kind of perspective. Now, in terms of the principles, so like any thought which is coming from Catholicism, they like to dress it up in fancy Latin. So there's jus ad bellum, that justice towards war. So you need to have good reasons for going to war. And they stress that it has to come from an authentic authority. So it needs to be coming from a legitimate government rather than something like a dictatorship. It needs to have reasonable probability of success. You can't just enter into a war that you know you're going to lose. It needs to have a justified cause, so it needs to be a war of self-defense. It needs to be a last resort. Now, as we'll see with a lot of them, some of them sound pretty okay on the face of it, and some of them are. But it really depends on the interpretation of them and what exactly is meant. So there's a meaningful way in which war should be the last resort. But if you mean you're going to go about and kind of do anything to avoid war until the enemies are at the gates, then I think that is improper. And even a kind of sticky issue in just war theory is the idea of a preemptive war. So if, when Russia is amassing troops on the Ukrainian border and it's very, very clear they're going to invade, it isn't clear from just war theory whether Ukraine can launch a preemptive strike, even though it's very, very clear that Russia's about to initiate a war. Whereas actually, I think under proper principles of justice in waging a war, you should be able to do that with full moral justification. Then you get jus in bello, so just conduct in war, which has the principles of distinction. You need to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants, which very much informs the narrative around the Israeli war at the moment. Proportionality, the force can't be disproportionate to the force which has been initiated against you. Part of that means, I mean, that could be applied in a couple of ways, but if, for example, carpet bombing is used against you, you can't use that, but you can't escalate then to nuclear weapons is the way it's sometimes thought of. Legitimate targets, so it has to be targeted against military objectives, and any damage to civilians or civilian property has to be collateral, and we can talk a bit about that. And then no means in malum se, so no means which are evil in themselves. So it rules out mass rape, torture, and the use of nuclear weapons, for example. And again, a mixed bag, because it's right to get rid of mass rape as a tool of war. Unfortunately, Hamas never learned about that, I think. But nuclear weapons. So, and you were making a point, Richard, which I think is right, which is that war isn't per se the enemy of peace. And this was a point I made on the show the other day. Militaries are the ones who can ensure peace and ensure that it lasts as long as it's done in the right way. And in the United States, when we're talking about Japan, they did use the nuclear weapons, not just the threat of them. And that was what's ensured the lasting peace with Japan, even to this day. And so people need to take that very, very seriously. And what just war theory often ends up doing is at best tying one hand behind your back, and meaning that wars don't ever properly get finished or finished in a proper way. And therefore they're perpetuated into the further generations.
Yeah. Marco.
And the old principle of the last resort and the self-defense only, effectively, it only guarantees that you're first attacked before you can do anything about it. And then when you're in war, in bello, you effectively have to spare your enemy and make sure you don't damage them too much by not being disproportionate. And all these effectively guarantee that you're going to be attacked, not immediately, but in the future. That's exactly what's happening with Israel. How many times Israel has been gone into a war with the Arabs with good intention and with proportionality, and how many times they responded a few years later with more rockets, more violence, until we get to October the 7th. If Israel stops now and it shows itself to be too good intention, or good intention at all, and even proportionate in its response, what are you doing? You're leaving behind a group of people who are devoted to the destruction of Israel and the killing of Jews, and we've seen October the 7th, the same people who vow to repeat it over and over and over again. So just war, effectively, if you applied it again, it would guarantee another October 7th, probably even worse, probably even bigger problems across the world, because you're sending the signal that, yes, you can attack us. Once the victim reach a certain point, we're going to stop fighting back. So you can destroy us, because the other side, let's remember, do not play by the same rules. They haven't got the limitation of these stupid theories. As I said, they are ancient theories that were developed in the Middle Ages, when the first nation states were created, and where the ruler were trying to live by the stupid Christians' doctrine and morality, and try and justify a war which goes against the love your neighbor and offer the other cheek. So why on earth are we still playing by these rules when they've been proven wrong? And we see concrete example all the time. And then mix into that altruism, and then we find ourselves fighting wars like the American did in Vietnam and Korea for the sake of it. Fighting wars where your interests are not even involved, and where you go and kill and let your youth die on a battlefield for a war that you have got any interest in involved. Keep doing the same mistakes and see if the result is going to be different. I don't think so.
I think just to take out the last resort point as an example, because you could pick apart any of these when you put them into context and actually look at a set of circumstances, they don't universally apply. And for example, what does that tend to lead to in this day and age and in recent decades? It's led to a lot of appeasement. It's led to delay. It's led to the going to the UN for resolutions whilst your enemy reinforces himself, and it's led to crocodile tears from the dictators on the other side, who pretend they're really not going to attack you while still continuing to amass forces on your border. Whether this is Putin, whether this is the Arab states in 1967, for example. I mean, each of those examples demonstrates that being encouraged to wait will only make your chances of being able to defend yourself less successful. And there is a point when you need to face the reality that you are at the very point of being attacked, and not wait for a chunk of your own side to die first for that to be the only measure that you are actually in a mode of self-defense. Now, it's not to argue that you should use self-defense as an excuse when there's no reason to retaliate, but it's clearly and yet last resort is clearly one of those phrases which, on the face of it, sounds common sense and logical, and because you want to avoid war. But we know what the endless diplomacy and appeasement has led to when people think that they can force you to compromise with evil, compromise and adopt some sort of grey morality that gives your side up a little, gives the good up a little in favor of the evil. And therefore, what does it lead to? It leads to you capitulating even more soon enough, and it leads to evil winning in the end.
Yeah, I was actually going to make the point that in Obama's speech, the one thing he got right was, the point where he says wage is the last resort or in self-defense. But yeah, I take your point. Also, the way I would think about it is wage is the last resort in the sense that you tell the enemy this is coming, and that is the first resort. And then basically, if they're still keen on the war, you give them what you want. I think the most clearly impossible rule here is proportionality, which essentially says that the actions that you can legitimately take in war will be determined by the aggressor of that war. So you need to sit down and wait and see and we see whenever I see commentary on this conflict, even without the use of the word proportionality, that is what they're saying, because they're obviously using Hamas numbers, but the number of people dead in Gaza is definitely much higher than the number of people who died on October 7th. And that is an argument, that is where they put it out there, and that's it. I mean, more people died in Gaza, therefore it is however many times people died is however much worse Israel is than Hamas. And those arguments in mainstream media and mainstream commentary go on unchallenged, which is, we're at a point where from all across the spectrum, from the absolute, supporters of Hamas to people who are supposedly supporting Israel, nobody can seem to come up with a actual just war theory, which is Israel was attacked, or such a theory applied to this conflict, which is Israel was attacked, it must end the war decisively and quickly in such a way that the enemy will never attack again. That is not an option, certainly not even within Israel. Morgan.
Yes, and the proportionality, as I said, is one of the ways in which it's really filtered down into the public consciousness. And then particularly when it's applied to the numbers, it's a nonsense, because it wasn't like the pro-Palestinian side was fine with everything up until 1,200 Palestinians were killed. And then, now suddenly this is unjust. So it really just works to go against the justified side. And unfortunately, there's a way in which to misapply the principle. You could look at Israel is being disproportionate, but it's not disproportionate in the sense of using overwhelming force. It's being disproportionate in the sense that the Hamas never phoned ahead to the kibbutzes to tell people to get out of those buildings because they were going to destroy them, or leafleted or whatever, or dropped in aid. So it's being underwhelming in the means which it's using, which is certainly immoral. And it's a real sign of the way that altruism plays upon the consciousnesses of people who would like to be well-intentioned and who aren't trying to be malicious, but end up doing malicious things, if you like. And to articulate, as you say, the principles of which a government should engage in a war, the responsibility of a government generally is to protect the individual rights of their own citizens. It isn't this Christian principle which is informing just war theory that all lives are equal, are to be considered equally by the moral agent. So that's why the theory puts so much weight on considering the lives of civilians on the other side, because they're just as worthy as the lives of your own soldiers. A government should value its own citizens' lives much higher. I mean, infinitely higher. There's no way in which you could subsume them to the other side. And yet that's what we see going on. And so a government in war should should follow whatever means it can to protect its own soldiers' lives whilst putting down the threat to make sure they can never do that harm to you again. And that would be a proper theory of just war, and not the theory of just war that we have.
ARCUK.
Yes. And what is justice after all? Justice is the principle that says you get what you deserve. So if you murder somebody, you cannot expect to be treated like a hero, because the reporting the war numbers, effectively, the reporting numbers and comparing numbers, all it does is hide what the motives behind the two parties are. Israel has been attacked since 1948, when it declared independence, by the Arabs around the area. Attacked. People have been murdered. And there's a constant barrage of rockets. That's why there is the Iron Dome in Israel, not because they like fireworks, but because they like to be alive and they like to protect themselves and their own citizens, which goes back to the validity of the Israeli government. It's a government, a state, which is there to protect its own citizens, exactly what Morgan was talking about. So this whole idea of a just process which hinders the defendant and protects the aggressor is totally flawed. You cannot live by this kind of morality. And it's not a surprise that comes from a Christian morality. As I said before, a morality designed to prepare you to be a dead corpse and a spirit in the sky, rather than teach you how to live on earth.
I think this just war theory feeds into a lot of the wider trends in the culture generally, like the equality trend, for example, that doesn't want to see success and failure, doesn't want to see a victor and a defeated party. It doesn't want the defeated party certainly not to be humiliated during their defeat, and therefore to capitulate on their ideology, because all ideologies are supposedly of equal moral validity in the way this world is looked at. That's like the Obama end of the scale. Then you have Trump's notion of what victory is, which is using the term frequently and relentlessly, and it having no meaning whatsoever behind it. It's just something that patting yourself on the back, and has no validity from that point of view. And then you've got the people like George W. Bush, for example, claiming victory too early. You can only remember him doing his share moment on the USS Abraham Lincoln. He was actually a Strider, a cannon, but it always reminds me of that moment. Where the mission accomplished speech, where he was claiming victory prematurely, and of course, he probably wanted to turn back time to when his father was president, and when he was in the first Gulf War, when he stopped before going as far as Baghdad and removing Saddam Hussein, leading 12 years later to the Iraqi war, which Bush was then claiming he'd finished and won, and it would continue to go on for years. Now, all of that demonstrates the fact that unless your agenda is clear, unless your cause is clear, and you do it with conviction, then you're not going to win. And the fact that that campaign, the second one, the Iraqi war, was called Iraqi freedom, shows absolutely what the aim is always an altruistic aim. You justify not via self-defense of the US, for example. You justify the fact that you're bringing liberty or bringing democracy or whatever to the country you're going to, when it's the self-defense element that should be first and primary, and the interests of the moral party should be first and foremost.
I hate to defend George W. Bush on anything. I think the only thing that makes George W. Bush look good is all the presidents who have followed. The one thing is that I think he's being a bit unfairly criticized for is that mission accomplished sign. Of all the things that were wrong about that war, the goal of removing Saddam Hussein from power had been accomplished. What hadn't been accomplished is all sorts of nation building stuff. And the fact that it was left to Iranian forces or whoever to step in and terrorize Americans, that is a whole other issue. But I think he's, there's so much to make fun of Bush for that. I think that is
the only problem, he accomplished the wrong mission. I mean, Saddam Hussein was way down the list of the people he should have hit. And what did he do? What was his mission? A war on terror. What the hell is terror? You don't even have the balls to say who your enemy is. The Saudi, ISIS, and Iran. I mean, come on, man.
That I agree with, although there was no ISIS then, and there probably wouldn't have been one had he fought the right enemies. But yeah, Marco, Morgan, you both mentioned Christian morality. Yeah, Christian morality applied to anything would not lead to positive results for humans on this planet, maybe in the afterlife, if they happen to be right on that, but just war theory as well. I think the only Christian morality I can get behind is the morality of Christian Klein giving us a 10 euro super chat. Thank you, Christian. He says, I fear Israel will see an unprecedented war on 4 fronts with Iran, Hezbollah, and West Bank fanatics joining soon. Its sheer existence will be in danger. It will be a second war of independence. Your thoughts? I have the very same fear. I think Israel has, in the way it's been fighting in Gaza and in its refusal to act, let's even leaving the West Bank, although I think action should have been taken there. The fact that it's letting Hezbollah remove the entire northern part of the population from their homes is just, what country in the world does that? What country says, okay, they'll leave? It's one thing to say they have to leave because there's going to be a war now. It's another thing to say they have to leave because right now rockets are being fired at them and we're not ready to do anything about it. And yeah, Iran has definitely been emboldened in to taking whatever action it would like to take, and I think it is, as we've seen from Israel. It's Israel is going to sit by, let bad things happen to it, so that it can basically cry to the world, look, please let us defend ourselves. Look what they're doing to us, and of course the world will say no, or yeah, do it proportionally. Morgan.
I don't know that a forefront war is completely unprecedented in the context of Israel's history, unfortunately, but certainly I saw that they'd cancelled leave for, I think, thousands of their soldiers, which presumably means they really are fearing that the war is going to meaningfully open up on another front, and that certainly is a prospect not to be taken lightly, and it's very worrying. Just to come back to just war theory, and so a large part of it again is the prohibition of certain means. So basically, it's informed by this perspective that you can't be too cruel in the means that you use. So if you use bullets, which are designed to deliberately lodge in the body or radiate outwards and leave shrapnel to cause a lot of pain to the sufferer, then you're not allowed to use that, or to use incendiary weapons in many contexts. Now, I understand the feeling of not wanting to be cruel because that's unpleasant. But in waging a war, you need to shock and awe your enemy in order that they fear you and back down and surrender unconditionally. And if you don't achieve that, if you don't achieve the total defeat of your enemy, like in the First World War, then if we're just going by the numbers, which isn't necessarily the right perspective, then that leads to the Second World War and so many more people dying. So people need to take the prohibition on means very seriously. And again, on the cruelty point, it rules out things like napalm. Now, people have probably seen the photo, I think it's from Vietnam, of the little girl running down the streets with napalm on the back of her legs, where she's crying. Now, pictures aren't a proper means of judging these things, but certainly if anyone's seen that, I don't recommend, if you haven't seen it, you go look at it unless you have a strong stomach, but that's awful. But you need to take very seriously that war is awful. There is no way of getting around that. You can't make it nicer. You can't make it less awful than it is inherently. And if you can't stand the heat, then you need to get out of the sun. I'm never going to put myself in a situation where I have to command the use of such a thing because I don't feel comfortable doing it. And it goes to the strength of a lot of military leaders who can do such a thing, that they can do that. And the prohibition on means is actually a way that further suffering and death is ensured rather than prohibited.
Yeah. I mean, you said war is a terrible thing. War is not good for either side. War is a destructive thing. There's no production in war. People say, oh yeah, when you go to war, the economy of one of the winning sides increases because production. That's not true. War, it means loss of death, loss of production, loss of economic activity. So there's no way war is good. However, the cruelty is perpetrated by the side which causes the war, the attacker, in this case Hamas, and the Islamic nutters behind them. And every single death in this situation, when you're fighting for your survival as a self-defense in order to remove the threat, the cruelty is on the hands of the person who initiated the violence in the first place. So even the loss of life for the aid workers, whatever, they're all in the hands of Hamas, and all this kind of stupid request from the world for Israel to pull punches and sacrifice more of the life of their own soldiers in order to appease a few Islamists. Well, that doesn't wash. It's effectively asking Israel to die and shiver and destroy itself.
Yeah, the idea that war can be run in some sort of lukewarm, cuddly, friendly way is just for the birds. That's based on an unreality that is invented by people who've been nowhere near a war. And they also seem to argue for some perfect peace, which is achievable in many cases with an aggressor without that war first. And that is equally unreality based. Yaron Brook gave a very good talk back in 2004. I think it was called America versus Americans. And I think in that,
Leonard Peikoff.
Leonard Peikoff, was it? Sorry, yeah. And some of the material you gave us was also related to Yaron Brook, where he was commenting on that and updating that, I think, in relation to the Iraqi war or just afterwards. And he made a few really good points in that. Well, many good points. It's definitely worth looking at that speech. He talks about terrorism and the fact that terrorism has an irrational goal, and that irrational goal is built on hope. And unless you crush that hope, that irrational goal will survive and persist. And that's what we see too often, is that hope is left to linger because of the cowardice or the pussyfooting around or the light touch. When that hope needs to be utterly crushed in order for the terrorism to dissipate, for it no longer to be pursued in the future. And he also made a good point, which relates to a lot of the innocence in war aspect. And I've got a quote here that I wanted to just mention, which is he talks about the civilian population of an aggressor nation is not a separate entity unrelated to its government. And war is an act of a nation. And a nation is an interconnected political, cultural, economic, geographic unity. And this is the key point, that a nation is made up of the economics, the culture, all of those aspects. And in order to defeat a nation, you need to defeat all of those aspects. You can't simply concentrate solely on those wearing fatigues, for example, particularly in the case of obviously Hamas, but they don't wear fatigues. They wear ordinary civilian clothes in the first place. But in order to end war quickly, and therefore for peace to endure, you need to make sure that the spiritual side of a nation is also defeated as well, and that hope that I mentioned earlier doesn't live on in that form. They have to relinquish the ideology and change to a new one, which should be based on individual freedoms.
And the idea that the civilians are not a legitimate target is totally bogus, because a civilian in Gaza is supporting Hamas, is hiding Hamas fighters, is hiding the hostages. So you cannot ask people, oh, the civilians are innocent. No, they're not innocent. They're part of the war machine. They're part of the state, or the group of people who attacked Israel. In the case of the Nazis, the Germans were guilty. That's why Dresden were justified. And that's why, as we said earlier on, the atomic bombs on Japan were justified, because you had to crush the population that were supporting the kind of regime. And it's only when you do that, you're going to have a proper victory and a proper peace process, where you can rebuild from scratch by having eliminated the idea that caused the war in the first place.
Yeah, you guys were discussing yesterday this video by the UN, this basically revisionist history of the Middle East, but the main point that the video was trying to get across, which is a major point of the anti-Israel side, is the Palestinians, the Arabs, whoever it was, they were there first. The Jews came, the Jews take their land. It's always fascinating to see how these people become this kind of unique type of individualist, if you will, when it comes to who is killed in a war, and you're supposedly supposed to have some sort of way of not killing anybody who is not armed and shooting at you at that moment. Interestingly, these Marco, you said Hamas is responsible ultimately for the death of the aid workers a few days ago, for the death generally of citizens, and that is true. But Israel is held accountable or held to be responsible for even the deaths of, in some cases, the people who were taken hostage within Israel when on October 7th, when Israel tried to get to them, tried to end the 8-hour or however long it was terrorist attack that took place that day. And we were talking a few weeks ago about this Al Jazeera so-called documentary, and that was a point that was made there. Of course, Al Jazeera is not exactly a Christian channel, but they are certainly playing on the West Christian morality. Certainly, when they speak in English, that is what they do. And again, those of us who buy it are responsible for our choice to buy that crap. Morgan.
Another aspect of the theory, which is relatively new, is just conduct after war, so jus post bello. Now, it's relatively new and concerns itself with various things like how you deal with prisoners after war and so on, but also ropes in ideas of nation building. And I haven't really looked at that in any kind of detail, but what I just suggest to people to have a look at, if you want to get an idea of the proper ways to deal with defeated countries after wars, I mean, there's one to make sure they're properly defeated, but we've mentioned a couple of wars in the episode, and examples of failures. So if you look at the ending of the First World War, the way that was brought about, the Treaty of Versailles, the various loans which were given to Germany, obviously failed in actually reconstructing the Weimar Republic into a viable ally, because it devolved very quickly into the Nazi government. And even if it hadn't been the Nazi government, it would have been communist, and it would have been awful as well. And then if you look at Iraq, the kind of nation building that was going on there didn't work. And all of those wars waged in the early 2000s in the Middle East have been utter failures. I mean, just go watch the video again of people clinging to the planes which were fleeing. Was it in Kabul in Afghanistan 2 years ago, or 3 years ago now almost? I mean, that was a complete failure. And then go watch our episode with Joseph talking about the US reconstructing Japan, where it took 7 years, but they did it and they were out and it was successful. And so those are the areas and the examples I would look at for proper and improper ways of dealing with an enemy after the war.
Marco.
Well, the message ultimately, if you are for peace, if you hate war, allow the moral side to end the war as quickly as possible, reducing the number of casualties as much as they can. By expecting a faction to live by this kind of morality, this kind of silly theories, again, medieval theories, you cannot expect any lasting peace. Ultimately, the actions of the individual on the ground is their own personal responsibility. You have to take responsibility for your own life and for your own actions. And the actions are dictated by ideas. If the ideas that are prevalent in a society are bad, the action will be bad. And we see exactly what's happening in Gaza. We see exactly what's happened in Nazi Germany, in Imperial Japan. And we've seen so many times. And by trying to continue and fight with these parameters, it's just impossible. I mean, it's quite obvious that this doesn't work. Why don't you give reality a go and just play by the rules of reality, and in order to achieve a lasting peace?
On the post-bellum, the after-war side of just war theory, I think one of the dangers in that aspect is the duty ethic that it presupposes, the obligation that it presupposes upon the victor to rebuild stronger than his own country, the country he's just defeated. And a lot of this comes down to the morality side of it again, the altruistic side of it again, where the package deal that morality is thought to mean altruism, that the terms are thought to be interchangeable, they're so woven together. And the expectation that the victor should be on his hands and knees doing everything he can to rebuild what he just blew up on the other side of the fence on the aggressor's side is obviously wrong, when you should be setting the example of building a nation through trade, through demonstrating the ways in which freedom and trade can allow a country to grow again and thrive. And of course, for the people, obviously to run it themselves as soon as possible, assuming they have, relinquished their old ideology and taken on an ideology that reflects that.
All right, we're about out of time. James Valiant says in the chat, "Give reality a go, my new motto." Well, James, my new motto is fix your Wi-Fi, but no. I like that motto. Christian, yeah, there's some chat about Trump's policy towards the Middle East. I agree. Trump was definitely better on Israel than Biden. Do we know what he would have done after October 7th? My guess is he would also be better than Biden on what Israel should do after October 7th. Overall, I distrust Trump because he is such a loose cannon that you don't know. And the fact that his response to October 7th was kind of to attack Netanyahu, because Netanyahu, after the election, called the winner of the election, as leaders of countries kind of have to do for diplomatic reasons. I don't know. I'm wondering. I'm assuming we're going to find out. But I'm wondering what Trump's policy will be towards Israel, if he's going to hold that against Netanyahu. If Netanyahu, maybe the way he's so apologetic to the world about everything Israel does, will decide to also apologize to Trump for, I don't know what's going to happen there. But yeah, basically, I think the world is screwed. And I think the world is screwed very much when I look at the U.S. Elections. Nobody good is going to win. That we can know for sure, unless Nikki Haley emerges from somewhere and somehow wins this. But yeah, I mean, the only thing that terrifies me more than Trump and Biden is the what's his name? It's Kennedy. So yeah, no, we're in for some bad times, and that's my optimistic parting note. That, and follow me on X at Razi Ginzberg. Morgan.
I agree that Trump was in certain respects better on Israel. I would just say that it's not for the reasons really that we're articulating how a government should act properly towards Israel or in a war. The thing that I think is worrying, and which was you got signals of in that kind of interview where he mentioned Israel, although there were, some things which sounded good. Trump is a real Tony Blair. He really wants to cut a deal, and he really wants to be the one responsible for it. Now, I know Trump supporters won't really like that, but I think he has a lot of signs of that, he's the one who'll come in and solve it, and that'll kind of be a feather in his cap. So I would worry if his base was showing signs of being wobbly about Israel, he might decide, I'm the one who's going to finish the peace process and I'm going to get them to negotiate. That would be what I would worry about with Trump. And you can follow me on Twitter at MorganCarter98.
Margot.
You got a point there. Trump is a businessman. He likes a deal. But I also think it's fairly realist about this kind of thing. I think he knows. Of course, yeah, he's in favor of Israel for the wrong reason most of the time. But he also knows that Israel is on the side of the good guys here. And I think it's something that Biden could bother to bear in mind in the few moments he's awake.
And yeah, and to be fair, Trump did some good things, like dropping the mother of all bombs on Afghanistan, for example, and demonstrating the fact that the US was willing to put its military might behind its moral position. That's fine. But if you're also then on another day shaking the hands of the North Korean leader and giving a dictator legitimacy, then you're doing the opposite of that. So it's the lack of consistency. It's the quick win PR headline side of it, which is what lets him down and reveals the lack of principled thinking behind it. So at his best, is that because he's thought about it, or because he's struck on the right solution almost by chance? Because unless it's consistent, it's also meaningless and doesn't set much confidence for the future.
Yeah, and I will say much more than I'm afraid for Israel if Trump gets back into office. I'm afraid for Ukraine, which I think Trump is going to throw under the bus. We are going to talk about, if war isn't enough, bad stuff to talk about, then we will be talking about Trump, I'm sure, between now and November, and very likely afterwards as well. So thanks, guys. Thanks, everybody, for watching. The Daily Objective is back tomorrow. It's 7 days a week. The reality show is back on Monday, but the reality show extra is on Saturday, Sunday, right after the Daily Objective. We have a few trolls in the chat here. Your comments get read, only the best of them, and without your name. But that is on the reality show extra. It is behind a paywall. Trolls, put your money towards a good cause and become YouTube members, and you will maybe hear your comments read. Marco, you have something to say.
Can I just remind the trolls that if you go to the briefly objective, there are actually lots of very short content that your little brain can probably take in. And it's really, really controversial. You're going to hate it.
Yeah, although the briefly objective is also for people with a big brain. So yeah, everybody should go check that out. And everybody should check this show out. And many people who would probably benefit from watching this content are not watching it. So if you think they should, share it with them. Like this show, comment, and of course, subscribe if you're not subscribed. Thanks, guys, for joining. Thanks, everybody, for watching. We will see you back here tomorrow.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.